Welcome to this week's episode of What's at Stake. I'm your host, Bryan DeAngelis, a partner here at the Washington office of Penta, and I'm joined today by two of Penta's senior partners based out on the West Coast, Dan Russo and TJ Kelly. Both Dan and TJ joined Penta earlier this year and have brought valuable experience to our senior client council and their agency leadership as we continue to build out our West Coast operations. In light of October being Cybersecurity Awareness Month, we're here today to discuss Penta's latest white paper, Cyber Risk is a Stakeholder Risk. The paper draws on insights from Penta's AI-powered media intelligence and stakeholder sentiment modeling, which assesses over 4.8 million global mentions from, in this case, January 2024 to August 2025. By combining this data with issue and audience-specific sentiment, the research really dug into how cyber threats reverberate across industries and stakeholder groups. The paper also identified some key trends to watch in the cyber landscapes and outlined critical steps that communications, policy, and public affairs leaders should take to strengthen their preparedness for what will inevitably be the next cyber event. So here to help us break all of that down is Dan and TJ. Dan, TJ, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Bryan.
I'm excited. This is your first episode, but first of probably many. So we'll jump right into it. Dan, you took the pen on a lot of this white paper, so maybe I can start with you just to lay out the big picture. You know, as I said in the intro, white paper really focused on cyber risk as a stakeholder risk. Walk us through what that means and why this has become such a reputational issue for companies and leaders today.
Yeah, I'm happy to dive in, Bryan. I think if I even reflect on why I jumped into this, it was one of the reasons I came to Penta was the excitement I had for the intelligence and the data we can bring forward. And I saw some of the research we'd done over the years on cybersecurity, and it was just one of those moments of like, wow, if we really dug into this, like, can we actually study over a year what industries are affected? What's the frequency of that effect? How does that come through the media, and how different organizations have responded to try to accelerate and move on from those risks or have fought their way through it. And these can be complicated things for brands to navigate. So, look, I think at its simplest, these are more common than ever, right? Exactly as you said. I saw over the weekend, the National Cybersecurity Center in the UK released some data that effectively said from August of this year to 12 months prior, about 200 national security and significant incidents had happened. The year before, that was 89, right? So you're seeing a jump in frequency, and they're also seeing a 50% rise in like the largest, most risky of those issues coming through, right? So regardless of how large your organization is, what industry you're in, you don't have to look far. It's going to happen at some point. So how do you get prepared? How do you work across all these different stakeholders? So, we looked at everything from F5's issue last week to the JLR issue in the UK, where they had to basically stop production, right, of all of their manufacturing. If you think about what that means for stakeholders, right, not only are their customers affected for the most obvious pieces, their entire supply chain had to pause, right? That required the government to step in. The government offered I think it was a $1.5 billion bond. Then you have shareholders who get involved. You have your policymakers that need to get involved. And quite frankly, your employees want to know what's happening, right? Some of them actually can't come to work. What does that mean for them? Where did this happen? How did it happen? So a lot of things here really came to the surface for us. And it was really interesting to see how different organizations kind of responded and worked through it.
I'm curious, before I go to TJ to break down some of the industries we looked at, that increase in frequency creates kind of this situation where both it seems to happen all the time, so we almost grow numb to it, but the frequency just shows how much more sophisticated these actors are behind the attacks and how much damage it can really cause. So I'm curious if you uncovered anything along those lines as you dug into this.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. You and I and TJ have done crisis comms and comms planning for a long time, and oftentimes those things get drafted and maybe put aside because you're constantly like dusting it off and trying to refresh it. I think what we're seeing is brands that are ready for them and actually thinking ahead to try to predict what's coming are perhaps the best suited to respond, right? The ones that have gone through it, the ones that have built that resiliency within the organization. They seem to be the ones that have the executives ready at a moment's notice to engage. They're the fastest to share communications. They're the most consistent in that messaging that's coming through in the media. So you're right. I think that's exactly what we're seeing. It's hard to break through from that because it probably would be a full-time job. But there are ways that we started to think about, right? And I think in the white paper, we talk through how you have to set up not only listening and monitoring that most organizations do, but try to predict what's coming around the corner that can help you. And a lot of the times you can set that up to be a little bit more automated and engaged and ongoing in the org. So it's not a reflective thing that takes up too much of your capacity.
Yeah, I want to come back to that kind of full-time job idea as we dig into what companies can do. But TJ, let me pull you into this. We looked into 6 major industries. We looked at the automotive sector, retail and telecom, tech, healthcare, finance, all, really touch consumers in both very intimate and different ways. What were the sectors, if any, that really stood out to you, either for the scale of the challenges they face or maybe the way some of them have responded to these attacks?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting and why Dan and I were so excited to dive into this more of actually looking deep into the sectors and having the ability to do that. It brings so much more to bear for the discussion and how folks can ultimately prepare for this. So I think key at a top line, there's really this cross-industry pattern that shows up in the data. And the closer you are to a consumer connection, the greater, the deeper the reputational damage, right? Like if you look at healthcare and retail as two sectors that have a really, really deep connection into consumers and consumers' data, the data bears out where retail had the most negative sentiment based on the breaches with a negative 77. And this is driven directly by data breaches affecting consumers directly. Those are more emotionally charged. It's a broader subset of consumers in that environment that are affected directly, and that is naturally going to bring more attention and a deeper negative sentiment. If you look at healthcare, sentiment never recovered due to breaches exposing patient data and care disruption. And Bryan, you mentioned the number of breaches, and Dan, it's 200 over a previous 89. With the proliferation of AI, we're only going to see that increase more. And when you have multiple breaches in a sector like healthcare, and there's care disruption and patient data exposed, the data shows that one cyber incident can affect the entire sector. So one cyber incident then in coverage reflects the previous incidents that have happened, and you naturally see the whole sector pulled back into this discussion each time there's an incident. So it drives the sector down. So everyone needs to be very aware of what's happening across their sector, especially when we're talking about consumers. And then, of course, every time we look at this, technology dominated, right? 74% of the mentions have the tech sector in some way, shape, or form. There's high exposure in tech to the incidents. One, because the other sector, even if it's happening in healthcare or retail, tech is going to get pulled into the who's at fault discussion. So specifically, if you're in technology, you need to look across the board because you're going to get pulled into the discussion, especially if you're a security firm or especially if you're someone that's ultimately housing this data on consumers for those other sectors. You're going to get pulled into the discussion, and there's going to be a who's at fault, and you have to be overly prepared for that. So those are top line, but there's a lot more really interesting trends in the data for each one of these sectors.
Yeah, can we dig into the retail and healthcare one a little bit and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but from some personal experience, because this hits all of us, retail feels personal, but in a highly annoying sense.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's where you're shopping, maybe some of your financial data. Healthcare is personal in a whole different way. And especially to your point, if it starts disrupting care, now you're in sort of a life or death kind of situation. But did you see anything along those lines as you unpacked the data?
Yeah, I think if you look at healthcare specifically, one incident around Change Healthcare and the data breach brought the entire sector down across all markets, down in the US, down in the UK, down in India, down in Australia, Canada, Germany, across the board. So one incident is global. It's affecting all markets. And then, oh, by the way, when a repeat incident of that happens, it actually doubles down on the negative effect over time. So these last for an extended period of time, and sentiment within healthcare holds down over time over an extended period. We looked at from January 24 through August of 25, and there were some blips of recovery in healthcare, but then there's also some steep declines in the more recent, McLaren ransomware attack. So each one of these attacks has a negative impact and holds the entire sector down over time.
Where, before we leave this section, where does financial services play into this? It's very top of mind for me. We just did some great work with the Aspen Institute around financial fraud and the attacks we see there. And that, can both be kind of a company-wide thing or an industry-wide thing, but it also feels very hyper-targeted where we're all getting those text messages of, allegedly call your bank, or, your Easy Pass is overdue in somewhere like Wyoming, and I haven't been to Wyoming ever. But, you do have people that fall for these kind of fraud and scams, and it can both take a toll on them personally, but I imagine naturally bleed into some reputation issues too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One, I think it's also consumers.
Right.
Yep.
Two, the ease in which scams can be masked and coded to consumers in this environment, right? Like it's all about end user entry points that increase your risk, especially in financial services. Financial services, a lot of individual customer communications over time for updates. Think about all the banking updates you get. Think about all the credit card updates you get. Now you have new environments with crypto where you've got more accounts and more opportunities for communication to be masked under the layer malware. And ultimately the focus there, it's just more exposure points. And it's something that we have to look at, and the tools need to be better to detect these. The end users need to be educated more to understand what's happening in this environment, especially as the population ages across countries that are more susceptible.
Yeah,
that's
it is a big factor.
Go ahead. The interesting intersection between like consumer awareness, education of their own security and behaviors, and then where that bridges over to the brand is really fascinating. I think too, what we saw in the data was almost like I think we saw like the USAA settlement, right? Which I think started in 2021, but just closed this year, became a whole nother wave of conversation about risk and everything else. So even though that was like moving on and behind them, it continues to come up. So once they're even resolved, there's a resolution that comes next. So again, how you prepare and how that really affects the brand and who you communicate is just so complicated right now.
It is. Well, let's maybe go there next. I mean, we know this and we work with a lot of clients, but we very much give the advice that this is too important not to be a whole C-suite, whole company kind of approach to both the reputation recovery, but even the prevention. And it's more than just containment and the response. It's a lot about, do you have the right tools? Are you thinking about the right ways to get around this? So both of you have worked on these issues. What have you learned about how organizations can really communicate both internally and externally more effectively in these moments, either before a breach or after a breach when this becomes a critical issue?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to start, TJ, but I think, I think we've outlined 6 things you could do to plan and prepare. I think we'll get into that in a minute. So if I look at this of like, once it happens, right? And it's tricky because armchair quarterbacking from the outside, it was like, it can't be this complicated. But when you're in that storm, it is, right? Because oftentimes an organization will work with third-party partners, whether they're IT consultancies or technology partners. So just even determining what happened can take time. And then you have to determine what broke down in that chain and where that breakdown happened, right? So going down that path, it can take days, even weeks to sort out where that issue came from. But I think at the most simple level, right, the ability to acknowledge that it happened, to engage your executives at the right levels, which is a discussion that you have to be prepared for, of like, which expert does it make sense to bring in at what time, but somebody who's going to clearly help lead the organization through it. You have to then have a plan for like what you're doing to correct it. And in some cases, overcorrect it to make sure people really understand that you took action to address the issue. And then the underpinning all of this is trying to communicate clearly and consistently throughout spikes and valleys, right? This is going to be top of the news funnel, and then it might go away for a little bit. And the minute you think you have it under control, it might come back again. So how you plan and really build the orchestration layer across the organization to do that is, I think, the special sauce in you.
Yeah, and I'll add, and maybe TJ, I'll pull you into this, but I remember the days where we would do this just by brainstorming. We'd sit and be like, okay, what could happen? And we'd maybe do it like once a year, and we'd come up with something in our head to say, this one's high risk, this one's low risk, and now you have so much data at your fingertips that can really start to show you not only what impact some of these scenarios could have, but the likelihood that they could, occur. Or, what we're starting to do more and more with a lot of our clients is coming back to that 3-4 times a year, looking at kind of where the momentum is behind a particular issue or conversation. So something that felt like, oh, this, could be a problem, but looks pretty low, likelihood at this point, say January, now it's heating up. We better get ready for this. How much do you see that being adopted, or what more can clients do there?
I think it's really tricky, right? Because you talk about the cadence-based preparedness and us running situations and scenarios and all of that. And I think the tools are so much better that we've even brainstormed as you prepare for quarterly earnings calls as a public company. Why not build this into that process?
Right.
And the rigor around it, where you're looking at this on a quarterly basis. Do you have the right stakeholders at the table internally? Do you have the right external partners engaged? And you're going through this process on a quarterly basis so that you understand the velocity of incidents in your sector. Are there more coming in your direction? Are they like companies on the same systems and all of that? So it's really a call to the IT team, the security team, government relations team, the communications team to come together on a more frequent basis to map these things out and not just run one simulation and think you're prepared over time or one brainstorm. You actually just have to build this into your standard operating procedure on a quarterly basis to anticipate new information, what's happening in the environment, and the predictive element of what's bubbling up and what's coming next is going to be critical. And so you have to feed that into a group in a unified way, and then allow those individual groups to do their own work to prepare in that environment. But the expectation is on a quarterly basis, you're going to come together and do this as a team.
I'm kicking myself for not thinking of that before, but I've spoken to chief legal officers, I've spoken to public affairs, gatherings, and I always make that point about really doing this quarterly, bringing the right people in the room. And the quarterly earning comparison is so spot on. That's right. If we just treated it with the same kind of scrutiny and importance to us 4 times a year, I bet you'd see a lot more companies ahead of this, or even, being able to quickly mitigate it and bounce back.
Yeah. I mean, think about a direct impact on your stock price.
That's right. That's right.
Just takes one.
It does just take one. We've seen it over and over. And it can just take one in the industry, as you kind of mentioned. We have thrown this term around a lot here at Penta, but we talk about a basket of peers and tracking what's happening in the, with some of your competitors, aspirational peers, whether it's an actual cybersecurity attack or just, a spout of negative press, or we see something ticking up for them that could lead into an attack, it's likely going to spill over into either the industry's reputation or it could very quickly come to your doors as well. So you've got to be prepared for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just when.
It's just when. The paper also talked about this point of cyber risk becoming and being a geopolitical issue. We see that through a lot of our work where there's state-sponsored actors, other issues, and it becomes a diplomatic matter as well as a business matter. What does that mean for corporate communicators and public affairs teams?
Yeah. So as we look at these, Bryan, like state-linked attacks, Salt Typhoon, APT-31, they're blurring the lines between corporate security and national security. We have a unique set of data that we're able to look at and really determine how these are affecting each other and how they're linked. And then what that does is it makes it more important for communications teams, public affairs teams, legal teams to be coordinated in their approach to response, but also the preparedness side of it. And I think this is a really interesting place for you, Bryan. Like if we look at companies in sensitive sectors, telecom, tech, defense adjacent, there's regulatory and, as you said, diplomatic pressure. Like how do we approach that from a public affairs perspective?
Yeah, we do see, call it Washington, get involved a lot in these kind of incidents. I mean, you're right. There's the geopolitical kind of diplomatic side where you might see this be from a state-sponsored actor or an organized crime ring that operates out of different parts of the globe. And it's not necessarily going after one particular company. It could be going after an industry. It could be looking to, weaken some of our, defense and national security strengths. So, clients have to be prepared and have the right people in the room, including their legal team, to work with government, with different law enforcement agencies to understand kind of where these threats are coming from, how they can prepare for them, the right way to report them back. And then, there's a little bit of a responsibility on government too. And we've seen industries push them, where they need to do more to protect American companies from those external threats. You also always have the sort of red meat congressional issues where if some of these attacks, even domestic attacks, happen too close to home on some of their constituents, it could be in the retail industry, it could be in other industries, you're likely to see your CEO or others get asked to come testify in front of Congress and answer some tough questions. So when we think about that team in the room, especially, and understanding what's going on with other peers and the data we need to pull in, I often insist to clients, government relations has to have a seat there. The legal team has to be involved because while we all have the best laid plans that the response goes well, this doesn't escalate, it's quite easy in today's environment for this to become a very political issue too.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And the coordinated effort in response and preparedness across stakeholders. And everyone should have a seat at the table. And that's critical to manage the long-term impacts of a cyber incident.
That's right. Yeah. Dan, why don't I wrap up with a question for you? And I guess maybe a fun, in air quote, note for our listeners. We are recording this episode for the second time because we got shut down yesterday with the AWS outage, and it disrupted not only this podcast, but Penta's business for thankfully only a short period of time. But it's another proof point that, these things can come out of nowhere, and it's only going to get more complicated as we move into the future. So as we kind of finish up this episode and you think about maybe what's next, what are some of the things you're advising clients and looking at to stay ahead of?
Yeah, I think there's one thing that kind of jumps out, especially reflecting on the last 24 hours of having to jump in and jump out of this conversation. But One of them is like, this is going to be more common. It's already very common. It's kind of becoming something that you can't have as a side project in any one group, or a side project that you just revisit here and there. Like we saw in some of the research that came out, the companies that were most proactively communicating about cybersecurity, about their plans, about their readiness, were better prepared to then act and respond and recover quickly. So how do you make cybersecurity and your organizational preparedness almost a key message or a core message to some of the initiatives you have throughout the year, right? So don't put this aside and don't just prepare for it, but think about how you build it into how you operate as a team, how we operate as a company, and then how we communicate, right, to our stakeholders. So the 6 imperatives that we outlined in the white paper give people like frameworks and tools and things that they can apply. But I think one of the key things I'd take forward is like, how do you actually build it into a sustainable communications program that you have already in place? This way, you're already building that muscle just by delivering your core communications, whether that's to policymakers or customers or employees. Having it become something you're open, you're talking about, actually not only gets you faster to prepare, it also gets your spokespeople more comfortable talking about it. It gets all of your stakeholders more in tune with your preparedness, and it just gets you into a better position to act quickly to respond.
Yeah, and that confidence in the outcome can go a long way in terms of response and then reputation. Well, Dan, TJ, thank you both again for joining us on today's episode. Hopefully the first of many with both of you, but appreciate the work you've done on this white paper and want to let our listeners know you can find that white paper on our website, pentagroup.com. And as always, remember to like and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can follow us on X at PentaGRP and, of course, on LinkedIn at Pentagroup. I'm your host, Bryan DeAngelis. As always, thanks for listening to What's at Stake.